In the summer of the year 101 before Christ, across the scorched plain of Cisalpine Gaul, the most feared people in the known world march toward Rome with the certainty of those who have never been defeated. The Cimbri advanced in a formation so vast that the horizon itself seemed to bend beneath their weight. Tens of thousands of warriors arrayed in a colossal square 5 kilometers wide by 5 deep, with 15,000 horsemen opening the way like the edge of a sword without a master. They had destroyed Roman armies before. They had made the Senate tremble. They had planted in the Republic the deepest terror its citizens had known since Hannibal crossed the Alps. But what waited on the other side of the plain was not the panic they expected to find. It was reformed Rome, hardened Rome. Rome transformed into a war machine forged by a single man with blood, dust, and will. And at its head, Consul Gaius Marius watched them with eyes that had already seen how a world comes apart. Then the dust rose. The July sun fell upon the polished helmets of the legionaries like liquid fire. The Cimbrian cavalry charged. Pilum against shield, steel against flesh, the dull roar of one civilization crushing another. The Cimbrian standards fell one by one onto the hot earth. King Boiorix died with his sword in his hand, surrounded by his nobles, choosing death before surrender. And when the dust finally settled over the Rudine plain, more than 100,000 warriors lay dead beneath the sky of northern Italy. That 30th of July, in the year 101 before Christ, was not merely a battle. It was the end of an entire people. And the echo of that day rang through Rome for generations. To understand what happened at Vercellae, it is necessary to go back nearly 2 decades and contemplate the terror that the peoples of the north sowed into the heart of the Roman Republic. In the year 113 before Christ, a coalition of Germanic and Celtic tribes from the lands of the North Sea began a migration without precedent in the known history of Europe. The Cimbri, a people of tall warriors whom the Romans described as beings, arrived from the ends of the earth, had abandoned their coastal lands driven by floods and famine. With them traveled the women, the children, the elderly, and the wagons loaded with everything they owned. They were not merely an army. They were an entire nation in motion, a human tide desperately seeking a place to settle. Rome responded with armies. Consul Gnaeus Papirius Carbo was sent north in the year 113 and was crushed at the Battle of Noraea. The barbarians from the north inexplicably did not press on toward Italy. They turned toward Gaul and Spain, buying time for Rome without knowing it. Time does not last forever. In the year 105 before Christ, the Cimbri returned, and on the Rhone River, at a place called Arausio, the history of Rome came close to ending abruptly. 2 Roman consular armies were destroyed in a single day by the rivalry between their own commanders, who refused to cooperate until it was too late. Ancient estimates speak of between 60,000 and 80,000 Roman soldiers dead, figures that made Arausio one of the greatest disasters in the history of the Republic. The Terra Cimbricus, as historians would call it, settled over the city like a shadow that would not lift. The Senate deliberated in an atmosphere of imminent catastrophe. Temples and oracles were consulted. Extraordinary sacrifices were made. And in that moment of collective desperation, one man stepped out of the darkness. His name was Gaius Marius, and no title described him better than the one they would give him afterward: the 3rd founder of Rome. Marius was what Rome called a homo novus, a new man without patrician blood, without consular ancestors, without the web of family connections that normally elevated a Roman to the highest offices of state. He had been born in Arpinum, a provincial town, into a middle-class family. He did not have the surname of the great generals, nor the fortune of the established senators. He had something better. He had talent. The first order of business was to reform the army. The traditional legion recruited soldiers who owned property, Marius eliminated that requirement. He opened the legions to the proletarii, the men without land or wealth, equipping them at the state's expense and transforming the legion into a professional army. Where once there had been militiamen who returned to their fields, now there were career soldiers who owed loyalty to their general more than to the state as an abstract concept. Marius also reformed the weaponry. The pilum was redesigned with its metal tip made of softer metal at the point so that it would bend on impact, preventing the enemy from picking it up and throwing it back. The soldiers were trained with a discipline that their contemporaries described as brutal, marching long distances, carrying their own supplies, digging camps each night with geometric precision. They were called Marius's mules. They were the most lethal mules the ancient world had ever seen. On the other side of the plain, the dominant figure was Boiorix, king of a people who had been marching without pause for 12 years. We do not know his face precisely, nor the words he spoke around the fires of his camp on the nights before the battle. But ancient texts speak of a leader of enormous authority, someone who had guided his nation from the north of Europe through Gaul, Spain, Gaul again, and finally over the Alps into Italy. He was the heir to a tradition of warrior leadership that knew no surrender as an option. Boiorix did not know what had happened to the Teutons, destroyed by Marius at Aquae the year before, or he chose not to know. When his ambassadors arrived before Marius demanding lands for themselves and for their Teuton brothers, Marius signaled to his guards. Teutobod in chains was brought before the ambassadors. The silence that followed needed no translation in any language. Also present in the Roman camp was a younger man whose career was only just beginning, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, legate to Catulus, commander of the allied Italian cavalry. Intelligent, calculating, with that cold ambition that distinguishes those who are going to change the world, Sulla would execute at Vercelli the decisive tactical maneuver of the entire battle. The relationship between Sulla and Marius, born in these campaigns, would sour until it became the First Roman Civil War. But that was still the future. For now, the two men fought under the same standard. The spring of the year 101 before Christ arrived in Cisalpine Gaul with the weight of the inevitable. The Cimbri had spent the winter plundering the region north of the Po, destroying granaries, taking captives, razing villages. But they had not crossed the river. They had not marched on Rome. Marius used that time with the ferocity of one who knows that every day is worth lives. He merged his army with that of Catulus on the banks of the Po. It was a combined force of approximately 52,000 men. Marius's 32,000 troops, veterans of Aquae Sextiae, plus Catulus's 20,000, less experienced, still marked by the two defeats suffered the previous year when the Cimbri had crossed the Alpine passes without anyone being able to stop them. The plain near Vercelli, also called the Raudine Plain in ancient sources, was chosen as the final battlefield. Marius had studied the terrain with the attention of a craftsman who examines his material before striking the first blow. It was open, flat, ideal for Roman cavalry, and the sun on that 30th of July would rise behind the Roman lines, falling full on the faces of the Cimbri advancing from the east. The detail of the sun was not accidental. It never was with Marius. The disposition of the army was calculated with precision. Marius placed his veterans on the flanks, the strongest arms of the formation, with Sulla and the cavalry ready to move when the order came. Catulus and his legions were placed in the center, a decision that Catulus interpreted as an insult and that Marius considered simply tactical. The center would absorb the frontal impact, the flanks would destroy the enemy wings, and the cavalry would complete the encirclement. On the other side, the Cimbri formed as always, in the manner that had made them terrifying for 2 decades. A line of 15,000 horsemen at the front. Behind them, the colossal infantry square of warriors with great shields and long swords, some chained to one another in the front rows so that none could flee. At the rear, the ring of wagons formed a barricade where the women and children awaited the outcome. It was the entire nation, there on that plain, staking everything it had on the weight of a single day. On the 27th of July, Boiorix rode to the gates of the Roman camp under a flag of truce. He wanted to know when and where they would meet. Marius looked at him with the calm of one who already knows the answer. The Romans, he replied, never take advice from their enemies about when to fight, but since the Cimbri were requesting it, he would name the place and the time, 3 days hence, on the plain of Vercellae. Boiorix accepted and returned to his camp, convinced he was settling the terms of one more victory. He could not know that he was accepting the most favorable possible scenario for his enemy. The days that followed were thick with muffled tension. Roman soldiers polished their helmets for hours until the metal shone like still water. Marius wanted the July sun, when it rose on the 30th, to be reflected in Roman steel with the intensity of a fire. He wanted the Cimbri to look east and see flames before they saw legions. The night of the 29th passed amid prayers and low fires. The most veteran soldiers, those who had been at Aquae Sextia and knew what their general could do with a well-trained army, simply waited with open eyes. They knew that dawn would bring something they would not forget for as long as they lived. At the dawn of the 30th of July, the plain was covered in fog. It was thick, white, sealed like a blanket laid over the fields by an invisible hand. It allowed no sight beyond a few paces. The Cimbri began to move when the horizon barely hinted at the first light, with the confidence of those who do not need to see in order to know they are the most numerous. 15,000 Cimbrian horsemen formed their line and advanced at a trot through the morning mist. Those enormous bodies on northern horses, with helmets decorated with figures of animals, roaring toward the empty sky, with the heavy cadence of those who have rehearsed victory so many times that they can no longer distinguish between certainty and fate. But the fog betrayed them. In the dense morning mist, the Cimbrian cavalry could not correctly judge distances or positions. The intended maneuver was a wide arc to the right, to draw the Roman infantry into open ground and surround it. The tactic that had worked for them so many times before. But in the fog, that arc became a frontal collision that no one had planned quite like this. Sulla's horsemen came out to meet them from the right flank with calculated speed. The allied Italian cavalry fought as a single organism, speed, cohesion, obedience to command above all else. They did not scatter in search of individual glory. Within minutes, the Cimbrian cavalry was pushed back across the plain. And then there occurred what in ancient battles so often determines the outcome before the main struggle has even begun. The retreating Cimbrian horsemen crashed into their own infantry, which was advancing at that moment in close formation. The colossal square of tens of thousands of warriors, some chained to one another to prevent desertion, suddenly found its own runaway cavalry smashing into its formations from within. Ranks broke apart. Commanders shouted orders that no one could obey because no one could move without pushing into another. Chaos settled into the heart of the Cimbrian army before a single Roman pilum had reached a single enemy infantryman. Then the sun rose above the fog. The Romans had calculated their position with care. Stationed to the west of the plain, with the sun rising at their backs, they watched the mist begin to dissolve under the growing heat of the July morning. And as the fog yielded, the rays of the sun fell full upon the faces of the Cimbri advancing from the east. The metal of the Roman helmets, polished for 3 days, returned that light multiplied into the eyes of the invaders. The northern warriors blinked, squinted, raised their shields trying to block a glare that seemed to emanate simultaneously from every legionary. Ancient sources describe that some believed the very sky was on fire. It was like fighting against the sun. Then Marius unleashed his veterans. The legionaries on the flanks advanced at the steady and terrible pace that distinguished the Marian army from anything the ancient world had seen until that moment. Pilum in hand, right arm drawn back, the soldiers calculated the distance with the coldness of those who have done this before. 40 paces, 30, 20, and the first volley rose from the Roman army like a dark flock that tore through the hot summer air. Thousands of pila swept across the plain. The first Cimbrian line was struck with devastating precision. The Marian redesign performed its function with cruel effectiveness. The tips bent on impact with the shields so that the javelins hung from the defenders' boards like metal tentacles that made it impossible to hold a shield normally. Warriors who had not been struck directly had to throw their shields to the ground in order to move at all. And without shields, on the burning plain under the July sun, facing the Roman legion in closed formation, with the short sword already in hand, they were prey. But the Cimbri did not flee, not yet. The enormous square continued advancing with the inertia of what has been moving for 12 years and knows nothing else. They pressed forward. They slammed into the Roman lines with the force of a mass in motion that no wall should be able to stop. And the sound that arose was that of two worlds colliding in a space that was not large enough for both. Steel against steel, body against body, the collective cry of thousands of voices fused into a single wave of violence that made the earth of the plain tremble. The Roman center, Catullus's legions, received the full weight of the frontal impact. It was those troops, the least experienced in the entire Roman army, who bore the advance of the Cimbrian mass at the most critical moment. They gave ground inch by inch, but they did not break, and while the center held, the flanks completed the trap. The Roman cavalry, having driven back the Cimbrian horsemen, did not pursue them across the plain in search of easy glory. It turned around, exactly as Marius had ordered days before, and it rode toward the rear of the Cimbrian infantry, which was still fighting toward the front, without knowing that death was approaching from behind. When the Roman horsemen struck the rear of the Cimbrian square, it was like closing the latch of a trap on an animal that does not yet understand it is caught. The Cimbri found themselves surrounded from all 4 points of the horizon. In front of them, Catullus's legions held without yielding the decisive step. On their flanks, Marius's veteran troops pressed inward with the accumulated force of years of training and the energy of Aquae Sextiae still fresh in the muscle memory of every legionary. And behind them, Sulla's cavalry destroyed every possibility of organized retreat. The colossal square, that formation which had crushed Roman armies on 3 previous occasions, began to compress upon itself. Warriors in the rear ranks pushed against those in the middle ranks. Those chained together became obstacles for their own companions. The space to fight disappeared. What followed was no longer a battle. It was a massacre made all the more brutal by the July heat. The midday sun on the Po plain is a force in its own right. The Cimbri, northern warriors accustomed to colder climates, began to succumb to the heat in addition to the weapons. Some fell from exhaustion before any sword reached them. The Romans, familiar with Mediterranean summers and with access to their water supplies in the nearby camp, fought with a stamina that must have seemed superhuman to their enemies. Boiarix watched everything he had built over 12 years come apart. With his closest nobles gathered around him in a circle that shrank with every passing minute, the king of the Cimbri threw himself into the heart of the fighting. He was not fleeing. He was not negotiating. He was doing the only thing a warrior king could do when his world was sinking irrevocably: die with his weapons in his hand, taking as many enemies with him as possible. Ancient sources record his final battle with a brevity that carries its own eloquence. He was cut down fighting. His nobles fell around him one by one, each choosing the same death rather than the dishonor of being dragged in chains through the streets of Rome. In the Cimbrian rear, where the wagons formed a circular barricade, the women watched as the horizon became absolute defeat. When the first fugitives reached the wagons seeking refuge, the women understood what was coming. There would be no honorable surrender. There would be no promised land at the end of 12 years of walking. Only the chains of Roman slavery. Many chose something else. Ancient texts describe what happened with a restraint that makes the account all the more terrible. Cimbrian women took their small children and killed them themselves before taking their own lives with their own hands. Some hanged themselves from the axles of the wagons. Others used the knives they carried for the tasks of nomadic life. Mothers who had walked for 2 decades from the far north of the world, who had crossed rivers and mountains, carrying their children in their arms, chose death before seeing them grow as slaves in a city that could never be their home. That image, more than any count of dead on the battlefield, speaks with the greatest clarity about the absolute nature of what occurred on the Raudine Plain. When the sun began its descent over the plain, 33 Cimbrian military standards lay in the dust. More than 100,000 warriors had died. Tens of thousands more were captured, bound, transformed into the greatest spoils of war Rome had seen since the times of the Punic Wars. The Roman army had lost approximately 1,000 men, a figure that in any other context would be a tragedy, and that here seemed almost impossible to believe. The Cimbrian War was over. The silence that followed was different from the one that had preceded the battle. Before the combat, the silence had been tense, charged with the compressed energy of thousands of men who know they are about to kill or be killed. The silence that came after was something else entirely. It was the silence of enormity. The silence of a field covered in dead, who in the morning had been a people, and by afternoon were history. A silence so dense it seemed to have weight of its own, as though the air itself needed to recover. The Roman legionaries walked across the Raudine Plain with that mixture of exhaustion and awe that follows victories too large to be absorbed all at once. Some gathered plunder, iron swords, amber and silver jewelry, helmets adorned with animal figures that would roar toward no sky ever again. Others simply sat down on the hot earth and drank water in silence. Marius walked the battlefield with the concentration of a commander still taking stock. The messenger chosen to carry the news was a man whose name meant nothing yet on its own, Gaius Julius Caesar the Elder, Marius's brother-in-law, who rode for days to reach the city with the tidings that Rome had been waiting for through years of mingled hope and dread. When the Romans heard that the Cimbri had been annihilated, the relief was of a nature for which no language has a precise name. It was not merely the joy of victory. It was the end of a fear that had settled into the deepest part of the collective spirit of the Republic for more than a decade. The terror Cimbricus had come to its end. In Rome, there were celebrations that lasted for days. The Battle of the Raudine Plain changed the world in ways that those who fought it could not fully foresee. The most immediate effect was the disappearance of the Cimbrian people as a historical entity, a nation that had traveled thousands of kilometers seeking a place in the world, that had defeated Rome on 4 distinct occasions before that July morning, was extinguished from the records of history. The few survivors who did not fall into slavery scattered north without leaving any collective trace. The children of the captured prisoners, many of them, would become gladiators years later, who fought under the command of Spartacus in the Third Servile War. Even in the most absolute defeat, the Cimbrian people found ways to make Rome tremble one last time before disappearing for good. For Gaius Marius, Vercellae was the summit of a career that had already redefined the Republic. Elected consul for the 5th time, hailed as the 3rd founder of Rome alongside Romulus and Camillus, he celebrated a triumph that history remembers as one of the most magnificent of the Republican era. But the man who had saved Rome would also sow, without fully intending to, the seeds of its destruction. By opening the legions to the landless, By creating soldiers who owed personal loyalty to their general, Marius set in motion the process that would inevitably lead to civil war. The rivalry between Marius and Sulla, already insinuated on the Raudine plain through the dispute over credit for the victory, would explode a decade later into the first armed civil conflict Rome had known since its founding. In military terms, the Marian reforms were proven valid beyond any doubt at Vercelli. The reformed legion, with its redesigned pilum, its uncompromising training, and its professional standards, was superior to any force the ancient world had known until that moment. That legion would later conquer all of Gaul under Julius Caesar. It would carry the Roman eagles to Britain, the Euphrates, and the Nile. All of it was possible because Marius sat in a northern camp and thought carefully about how a soldier ought to fight. The dust took hours to settle over the Raudine plain. When it finally did, the plain was a nameless cemetery beneath the sky of the Italian summer. 120,000 people who had dreamed of a land where their children could grow up in peace lay upon the earth that would never be theirs. Their standards were in Roman hands. Their king was dead, with his sword in his hand. Their world had ended with the cold precision of a well-executed military maneuver. And Rome, the city they had made tremble for 12 years of terror, was already sending messengers at a gallop with news that would set the bells of every temple ringing. That July morning was not only the end of the Cimbri, it was the moment when the ancient world turned on its axis and began to become something different from what it had been. And at the center of that turning, motionless as the axle around which everything else rotated, stood the figure of a man born without an illustrious name, who had decided that names mattered less than deeds. Rome called him its third founder. History calls him Gaius Marius. And in the silence of the Raudine plain, amid the dust and the heat and the unbearable weight of the dead, that name became something larger than a man. It became an idea. The idea that Rome, no matter how great the enemy, no matter how deep the fear, would always find a way to survive, even when that survival carried a price that only time would reveal in full.